Welcome to the Church Resource, where we talk about the best resources for pastors, leaders, and lay people. I'm your host, Jeff Oliver. Today we look at the book, Suffering and the Sovereignty of God. This is by John Piper and Justin Taylor, who are listed as general editors of this. There are 9 chapters in this book. John Piper contributes 3 of those, and Justin Taylor some other ones. I'll tell you about the authors of this book in a moment, but I wanted to let you know that most of the chapters in this book were from talks that were given in a 2005 conference, the Desiring God National Conference. You'll recognize that as being John Piper's work, and that's his ministry name, in fact, Desiring God. Well, these talks were given, and then the authors were asked to take those talks and to revise them for print. And so they've done that, and this is what has come out of this, out of that conference, and now into this book that I'm holding now. So this is one that I think that you really need to take hold of and make sure that you understand it first as a kind of a theology of suffering and of understanding the sovereignty of God, the holiness of God, but then also as you minister to other people, that they would be able to understand it because you have ingested this and you have helped them with what we're dealing with here in the topic of suffering. I have given this book to somebody who has dealt with the loss of a child, for example, and I've been able to read this and then help someone else who was dealing with some other source of pain or loss in their life. And so I know that it's a very practical book, and they mentioned that here in the foreword. I'll mention that in just a moment, in the introduction, rather. But I wanted you to know where this came from. It was from that Desiring God conference, and these are talks that were given there. So the introduction points out that it says that some very deep and difficult truths are embedded within these pages, but it's not an academic book. This is applied theology. This is not mere theoreticians waxing eloquent about abstract themes. This theology has been forged in the furnace of affliction. For example, he says that 2 of the contributors are paralyzed and deal with chronic pain. 2 experienced the death of a parent when they were young. 2 had children who died in the past few years. 2 are currently battling prostate cancer. And he says the point of mentioning this is not to portray them as victims or to elicit your sympathy, but to let you know that these are fellow soldiers. These are people who have dealt with the very issues they're talking about. This is not an academic pursuit. This is not some ivory tower pontificating about the subject that they want to tell you more theologically and yes, biblically about what they're talking about. But these are people who fought through it. These are people who understand what they're talking about and can then pass that along and help you to understand the very subject of suffering as it relates to God's sovereignty in our life. So this is that's one reason that I treasure this book and go to it often to understand the subject of suffering as it deals with our Christian walk, because we will deal with that often. That will cross our paths so many times as we live life, as we make relationships, as we have people in our circles who deal with suffering. And it's wise for us to be able to deal with these situations well and intelligently and biblically and really from our hearts, so that we would be able to help others with it. So I just want to tell you about one of the particular chapters here, that one of the ones that John Piper has written in the second section of this book. Let me back up then and tell you what the sections of the book are. He says that in part 1 we talk about the sovereignty of God in suffering, and then there are a couple of chapters about that very topic. Part 2 is about the purposes of God in suffering. So we're really here in the book, we're building a theology of that, and these authors write very well to those points. And then in part 3, we're talking about the grace of God in suffering. So how does this play itself out? How does God's grace relate to what I'm dealing with? The subject of suffering, some good biblical counselors there in this part especially. And then the end of the book is from Johnny Erickson Tata, who is one of those who they mentioned earlier, is paralyzed and had to deal with her life in that way. And to really understand the sovereignty of God in her personal suffering. So as John Piper deals with the second section of that book, and this chapter called Why God Appoints Suffering for His Servants, he says that suffering deepens faith and holiness. He also points out that God is glorified in our suffering as people see the way that we deal with issues that come up in our life. Again, suffering makes your cup increase. He says another part of this is that suffering is the price of making others bold, that it will help others then to be strengthened in their faith and to move forward in faith to do what God has put before them, or just what life has thrown at them sometimes. This chapter, if any of that sounds familiar to you, you've read some John Piper, this chapter appeared somewhat almost the same in John Piper's Let the Nations Be Glad, the Supremacy of God in Mission. And so that's a standard kind of a classic book on missions, and this very chapter about God appointing suffering for His servants comes out of that. Now, one of the illustrations that is used in the book in this chapter, and then in one other chapter, is the missionaries that went to one of the jungles, remote parts of Ecuador, and were ministering to people there, and then were brutally killed. They thought they had gotten some relationships built, and they had a kind of a rapport with the native people there, and then they were killed. This is talking about the missionaries, Jim Elliott and Elizabeth Elliott, his wife, and then the Saints, that family, and Steve Saint is one of the contributors to this book as well. So we'll see that story a couple of times in this book, and it's a powerful story. And then what you see later is after these men were killed and left their wives and children in another part of the island, that the families came back then and still ministered to, were able to get the gospel in and even baptize, and just see a tremendous growth in these people who had murdered their husband or father. And that is one of the things that comes out, Piper points out and Saint points out as well. It's one of the things that came out of that tragedy that happened there, is that God was glorified because people came to faith, seeing the love, seeing the unconditional love and forgiveness that came from the people in that situation. So that's a strong part of this book, and I think it's important for you to know that story. It is outlined a little bit here in the book, and it's a good one here for our recollection and for our instruction. So one last part of the book that I want to point out, and this is in the appendices, that there are two interviews that go on between one with John Piper and David Powlison, two contributors to the book, but who are talking about the topic of cancer. And David Powlison dealt with cancer, actually died from cancer a couple of years ago now. And so they are talking about very, again, practically and biblically, but thinking through this topic of cancer and and how it has impacted the relationship with God and their understanding of God. The second interview that's presented here is with John Piper and Justin Taylor, and this is just another interview that will kind of sum up the book and pull out the purposes of the book. Hope you'll find that interesting, and again, keep this as a ready reference for you, and even copies of it on hand to be able to give people who deal with just tragedy in their life that comes. Because the more we deal with people, the longer we're around more people, it's absolutely sure that we will deal with some of these situations, and that we're going to need to know how to confront those, and in a way that is honoring to God. Well, again, Suffering and the Sovereignty of God. John Piper and Justin Taylor are the editors of this book, and it's just one book from my shelves that has been helpful to me in my ministry. I hope it gives you a bit of direction as you prayerfully consider which resources will best help you and the people you minister to. Thanks for listening to the Church Resource. Please make sure that you give us a review. And if you have any suggestions of resources that you would like us to look at, email us at thechurchresource@gmail.com. That's thechurchresource@gmail.com.